Okay, welcome back, students. The next chapter that we're looking at is the chapter dedicated to the topic of performance management, which is also critical and an important activity within the human resources management function, because it involves having some form of established benchmark through which we understand what is good or what is bad, and being able to assist people to receive information so that they can improve, or to be able to use that information to be able to make decisions important, such as how much pay is given to one person over the other, considering important issues around performance management. The most important and critical thing that must be borne in mind here is that performance management must be shown to have been done in a fair, consistent manner, because it's not just about saying worker A works better than worker B, but it's also about showing it through recognized metrics that exist, how the two are different, and what interventions the employer can use to be able to assist both employees. So, like with every chapter, we have a set of learning outcomes, and remember I said these are useful to you as you learn, because they will tell you what is most important to learn in the chapter, and they will also tell you what you need to know, and also you can use them as a way of ticking at the end whether you've actually achieved the objectives set out in the chapter or not. So let's begin by looking at the entire process of performance management, which looks a bit murky and complicated in this diagram that you see here, but each and every one of these components becomes critical in informing the performance management process. We take into consideration the strategic objectives of what it is that we're trying to achieve. These are embedded or supported within a context, which is part of the organizational structure. So if you like, the organizational structure is like a skeleton that holds the organization together. And the body, really, as it functions, is held by some form of architecture, which is this organizational structure. The structure consists of rules, routines, activities, programs, and so forth. And then we also go into aspects of job design and job profiling, which we spoke about earlier on when we started the first two chapters, which is really looking into aspects such as, do we know what the job is about? What are the main activities and expectations of what the job entails? And as a way of informing all of this, linking it to the individual, how the individual performs, linked by a performance agreement, which is monitoring how they are performing, which is also reviewed. It's not just set in stone, but it also needs to be reviewed as a way of arriving to some form of an understanding of those constituents that are important to be able to be improved upon. I've often heard in some cases I've read, especially in the CCMA, where an employer makes an arbitrary decision to fire an employee. And as they fire an employee and the matter is presented after the employee then makes a decision to appeal the firing, questions are asked. Well, employer, employee, they both knew the challenges that were restricting this person to work effectively and efficiently. But what was done to try and assist this person, the employee, to be able to improve on that? And in the absence of any form of activity being done, it may work well in the employee to be able to realize that the burden of proof and the burden of responsibility as an aggrieved person is for them to try and find a way of remedying the situation around lack of performance through not just interventions such as training, but a sound performance management process where review is also taken into consideration. Ultimately, all of these have consequences which are around how we pay people, opportunities for development, who succeeds who in terms of future opportunities, and also aspects of counseling employees for performance. And that being said, then we introduce you to 3 organizational level performance management approaches. Now, these approaches are approaches that are commonly used, not just in South Africa, but internationally, in trying to arrive towards ways of ensuring sound performance management. The first of these, and I've just put them as points, but you need to go and read them further in the textbook. The first of these is an objectives setting approach, which is really driven by data, quantifiable data, to try and show where problems in the performance management process exist and how these can be remedied. Then we have the benchmarking approach, which is looking at comparison, looking at what others are doing and using that as a way of benchmarking with an employee to say, based on the standard that we've set as a benchmark, this is how you're doing. Are you performing above the standard or right at the standard or below the standard? And then we also have something very interesting, which we'll focus in the end there. It's the balance scorecard, which is really a unit and a measure that an organization uses to achieve 5 distinct key objectives. And these are then used as a way of understanding whether we can say performance has happened or following up on any form of intervention related to the performance management process. And so we look at each of them briefly. The objectives approach, remember I said it's an aim towards quantifiable data. This leads to a management practice, which is MBO, management by objectives, linking objectives to monitoring aspects of performance that need to be achieved, seeking to link what they call intent with the day-to-day organizational activity, and then using that information to be able to draw some form of objective pattern of whether this has been done. Or it's a process of trying to set objectives, breaking down those objectives into goals, objectives, and strategy, and then making them cascade into every division or department in the organization. So management by objectives really relies on a manager taking active steps to work with the employee, to assist the employee to be able to achieve objectives as they are set, and ultimately that influences their own performance. As benchmarking, as I said earlier on, it's about comparison, providing some form of comparative data that is used as a way of saying, according to this comparison, either you are performing to the standard, or you're below the standard, or you're way ahead of the standard, as a way of comparison. And then finally, the balance scorecard seeks to achieve a range of objectives. These objectives are 4. Some in the literature have added 5. I'll talk about that later. The financial aspects, for instance, return on shareholders' investments, so shareholder equity, and how this influences financial success. Paying attention to what our customers are saying about us, how are our customers seeing us, and what must we do to keep them satisfied. Internal business processes and understanding, for instance, what are the units inside our organization doing, and what is it that makes them excel way ahead of the others, and all in the view of trying to keep customers or retain customers, which is linked to the previous point. Learning and growth, how does the organization sustain its ability to keep and develop itself, particularly on quests, as you will see in the training and development chapter, quests linked and related to learning and growth. Others add a 5th dimension, which is paying attention to the entire organization-wide process. You'll see later on in your 3rd year when we look at strategic management. This is a common edition, which is more holistic and looking at it from a broader perspective. So now we get to the key things in the chapter. The first important thing you need to know in the chapter are steps towards the performance management process. Now, these steps are helping us in a systematic, linear, one after the other format, if you like, to be able to understand how we understand the performance management process. What I've done is I've put the steps on the slide here. You will need to go and put the missing information under each and every one of these steps. So step 1, the strategic business objectives. If you remember in the training and development chapter, we also pay attention to objectives. So here we align whatever performance management process that we want to achieve to the business objectives. What is it that we want to achieve as a firm? What is it that we want to achieve as an entity? We then meet to agree on personal objectives as well. Remember, we said earlier on that part and parcel of the things that you're going to learn in this module is that it's not just about pursuing organizational objectives. It's also about pursuing objectives related to the individual. And so personal objectives also matter, and seeking a way to align or to have a fit between those personal objectives and what the individual seeks to achieve. We then are engaged in the process of assessing the performance. In other words, we have agreed on the objectives, we have agreed on the business objectives, the personal objectives. We then assess how people are performing based on those metrics. Now, the assessment of performance here is looking at, in view of those personal objectives, in view of those strategic business objectives, is there any evidence to show that the employee is performing to the required standard? Constantly, we need to meet to review the performance. Remember the example I gave you earlier on. We need to meet, because if we don't meet, the challenge that often arises is that the burden of proof will then be on the employer to try and show if there is a reasonable request to dismiss an employee, to say, we gave this employee ample opportunity. We even met and reviewed performance. We even met and improved conditions so that they're able to perform better. In our approach, like assessing performance step 3, we can then use different methods of assessing performance. And each of these methods, like any other methods in the other activities that we look at, are linked to context. It's about understanding the context, the situation, and the circumstance, and helping this to drive what we want to achieve. So some of these objectives, are appraisal methods, are noted as on the slide. The first of these are objective setting measures. Remember, when we talk about objectivity, it's a quest for more quantifiable type of data to be able to provide justifiable and reasonable action to assist employees in their path. The critical incident technique, which is looking at the most core issues that are found in a job, and then using those as a way of saying, according to these core issues, this is how an employee is performing, either well or bad. And then benchmarking, comparative rankings approach is really to say, in view of the 15 employees that we have, these are the ranks according to who's performing well and who's not performing well. This can also be linked to a paired comparison, where you could have 2 employees pegged against each other to then say which of these is performing better, or a forced distribution, where you either have to say employees will only be in 3 cohorts. The first one, excellent performers; the second one, average performers; the third one, poor performers. So you then put the whole mix of employees into each and every one of those 3 categories. The challenge here is that if an employee is borderline between poor and average, okay, this becomes very difficult to try and classify. We can also look at what we call behavioral approaches, where we look at behavior. Remember, in training and development, we try to change behavior. So where we look at behavior as a way of trying to understand it from the context of how we assess performance. We have behavioral checklists, behavioral anchored rating scales known as bars, and 360-degree feedback. 360-degree feedback is when you can take different people. Let me illustrate this one. You can take one person, and then that person is then given feedback around their performance, where they are in the middle. Okay, I'm going to show this now. Where that one person is in the middle. Okay, let's try this again. Where that one person is in the middle, and they're then given feedback by all those people who are working around them. And that's called the 360-degree feedback. And that's quite interesting because it obviously gives people different types of portals through which they can access information around performance. So remember, we said the focus is on objectives. You've heard about SMART. Objectives in terms of performance should be specific, measurable, acceptable, realistic, reasonable, time-bound, clear, flexible, prioritize, and several, so that you'll be able to actually allocate which of those is most important. And this is the 360-degree feedback, where in the middle is the person who's being appraised, and all around them there are different types of people who offer then feedback around the performance that has been meted out. Remember, we spoke about the forced distribution. On one end of the continuum, you will notice that we've got top performers. On the other end, we've got your average performers. And on the bottom end, we've got your lower level performers. We then have to force a rating of each and every one of the employees into any of these three categories. And like I said, the challenge really is these borderline cases, because the borderline cases is either you are on the one extreme or you're on the other extreme. And that makes it difficult to assess such people for the sake of performance. When giving feedback, we need to be specific about some things. Feedback must be specific rather than general. So you can't write on a performance appraisal, you need to improve your performance. But what aspect of performance is really needed to be improved upon? Focus on the behavior rather than the person. And it comes very common. Someone have said, don't mark the man, mark the ball. It's easier then to be able to provide a very objective appraisal. Take the needs of the receiver and their feedback into account. They are a human being. Give them that dignity they deserve, and also offer them an opportunity that they can develop. Aim behavior about which the receiver can do something and change within their powers. If it's an organizational change that's needed, that must also be meted out and clearly stipulated. Share information rather than give advice around the timing, and also involve what was said or how it was said, but not why it was said. And also provide clear channels of communications. Those are basic guidelines that can be offered towards performance. But what if performance appraisal has been done through the basic management process, and then we have another process, poor performance continues? We then get into the realm of the steps of managing poor performance. Remember, the first steps that we looked at were the steps looking at the performance management process in general. Now we are looking at the steps for managing poor performance. Agree, number one, that there is a problem. And how do we know that there's a problem? Well, the continuity of the problem, the perpetuity of the problem keeps on happening, that the same issues keep on coming up again. Let's isolate and identify what this problem is. After we've done that, let's identify reasons, explore and identify reasons. And let this not just be a manager or an organization doing it. Ask the individual from their own personal perspective, what could be some of the reasons why they're not doing well? Let us agree on a corrective action, implement the corrective action, and then we monitor the process. So let's say if an employee constantly comes to work drunk and they've been told that it is affecting their performance because of that, then we sit down with the person. Let's acknowledge that the problem here is their drinking habits, which is affecting their performance. We then explore different reasons why this is so. They go drinking on a Sunday before they go to work, or they try to drink the morning before they go to work. And then we agree on corrective actions, what the individual needs to be doing, and we start monitoring those actions as we go on to try and see if we can manage for poor performance. Linking to this, we also can counsel employees to be able to manage issues of performance. So this is what we call counseling employees for poor performance. Number one, let us identify those needs and those problems that are causing the poor performance. Let us understand the problem within the context of the individual and how it is affecting the context of work. We then go into some interesting aspects, which is action planning, which is more collaborative type of engagement, where we put actions into on paper and try and see how the individual can plan around these to try and achieve objectives. And then we subsequently manage the problem. So what we've done here is we've identified a range of factors. The first one which we can look at is the counseling for poor performance. Please note, this is counseling for poor performance. And also, we also can manage poor performance, distinctively linked to the steps of the performance management process. And I think those distinctions need to be made. And we've also identified a range of tools that exist to be able to manage performance at an organizational level, ultimately not just for the benefit of the organization, but also for the benefit of the individual. See you in the next chapter.